The morning mist hung heavy over the joint security area of Panmunjom on August 18, 1976, as a team of American and South Korean soldiers approached the now infamous poplar tree that stood between Observation Post Number 3 and Checkpoint Number 3. What should have been a routine maintenance operation would escalate into one of the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War era, bringing the Korean Peninsula, and potentially the world, to the brink of nuclear conflict over what historians would later call the most expensive tree removal in history. The tension had been building for years in the DMZ, that narrow 2.5-mile-wide buffer zone separating North and South Korea. The poplar tree in question had grown to nearly 100 feet tall, its branches obstructing the line of sight between UN observation posts. For months, U.S. Army officers had requested permission to trim the foliage, viewing it as both a security concern and symbolic of the delicate balance of power in the world's most heavily fortified border zone. The decision to cut the tree was not taken lightly. Officers weighed the implications of even a minor action in an area where both sides were locked in an uneasy truce since the Korean War's armistice in 1953. With tensions already high due to a series of border skirmishes and provocations from North Korea, the command decided that maintaining a clear line of sight was essential for the safety of UN personnel. A small detail, but in the DMZ, where every move carried political and military consequences, even the trimming of branches could be perceived as an act of defiance. On that fateful morning, two American officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, led a work detail of 5 South Korean soldiers and 4 U.S. enlisted men to trim the tree under the watchful eyes of North Korean guards. Carrying axes instead of chainsaws to minimize noise and disturbance, the men set to work. It should have been a brief operation, but within minutes, the situation spiraled out of control. A group of North Korean soldiers, led by Senior Lieutenant Pak Chol, known to the Americans as the Bulldog for his aggressive demeanor, arrived at the scene. The North Korean soldiers demanded an immediate halt to the operation, claiming that the tree had been planted by Kim Il-sung himself and was therefore sacred. Captain Boniface, under orders to proceed, ignored the demands and instructed his men to continue cutting. The tension escalated as the North Koreans, outnumbering the Americans 2-1, began shouting threats. Without warning, they attacked. The North Koreans, armed with clubs, pipes, and their own axes, overwhelmed the unarmed American officers. In the chaos, Captain Boniface was bludgeoned to death on the spot, while Lieutenant Barrett managed to escape momentarily before being hunted down and killed. The surviving soldiers retreated as the North Koreans fled back across the Bridge of No Return, taking their weapons with them. Within minutes, the DMZ, already a volatile flashpoint, had erupted into a full-blown international crisis. News of the killings reached U.S. military leadership within hours. The reaction in Washington was swift and severe. President Gerald Ford, along with his top military and security advisors, convened an emergency meeting. There was no doubt that North Korea had intentionally escalated the situation, and the United States needed to respond. The question was how. A full-scale military operation was considered, but the risk of triggering a second Korean War, and possibly a nuclear confrontation, was too great. Instead, U.S. commanders devised a response that was as overwhelming as it was symbolic. Operation Paul Bunyan. On August 21st, just 3 days after the killings, the operation was set in motion. At precisely 7 a.m., a convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles rolled into the joint security area. This was no ordinary tree-trimming crew. In the lead were 2 8-man teams of military engineers armed with chainsaws, their job to finish what Boniface and Barrett had started. But they were accompanied by a staggering show of force. 2 companies of infantry armed to the teeth, attack helicopters hovering above, and artillery units primed just beyond the DMZ. B-52 stratofortresses, capable of delivering nuclear payloads, flew low over the peninsula, while aircraft carriers moved into strategic positions offshore. South Korean special forces, armed with grenade launchers, crouched in the grass, ready to storm across the border at a moment's notice. The message was clear. The tree was coming down, and any interference would be met with full military retaliation. As the chainsaws roared to life, North Korean soldiers stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Unlike the first encounter, they made no attempt to intervene. The operation proceeded without resistance, and within 42 minutes, the poplar tree that had nearly sparked World War III was reduced to a stump. The impact of Operation Paul Bunyan was immediate. North Korea, realizing it had severely underestimated the American response, suddenly reversed course. Just days later, the North Korean government issued an unprecedented statement of regret, one of the only times in history the regime had admitted any fault. Though it fell short of an official apology, the carefully worded statement was seen as a rare concession from Pyongyang. The crisis passed, but the lessons endured. Operation Paul Bunyan demonstrated the power of overwhelming force as a deterrent, proving that even the smallest provocations in the DMZ could have massive geopolitical consequences. In the decades since, the poplar tree incident has remained a case study in military strategy, psychological warfare, and the fragile nature of peace on the Korean peninsula. Today, a plaque and a stone monument stand at the site where the tree once grew, a stark reminder of the day a simple tree-trimming operation nearly ignited a global conflict. The story of Operation Paul Bunyan continues to be told, not just as a bizarre episode of Cold War history, but as proof that even in a world armed to the teeth, sometimes the greatest show of strength is knowing when to wield it. When the trimming team arrived on that fateful August morning, they carried nothing more threatening than pruning tools and axes. The 5 American soldiers from the 8th Army and their 11 Korean Service Corps workers had conducted similar operations before under the watchful eyes of North Korean guards. The task was simple: trim back the overgrown branches of a poplar tree that obstructed the line of sight between 2 key UN observation posts in the Joint Security Area, JSA, of Panmunjom. But this time something was different. There was an unusual tension in the air, a sense that this mission would not go as planned. As the workers began their task, North Korean Lieutenant Pak Chul approached with 15 armed soldiers. Pak, known for his aggressive demeanor, had a reputation among American forces as a belligerent and volatile figure, later earning the nickname Lieutenant Bulldog. He demanded that the Americans and South Koreans cease their work immediately, arguing that the tree had been planted by Kim Il-sung himself and that no one had the right to alter it without North Korean approval. The Americans, aware that they were operating within the neutral zone under the United Nations Command, UNC, refused to comply and continued their task. Tensions escalated rapidly. Pak Chul's expression darkened as he muttered something to his men. Witness accounts and declassified documents later revealed that the North Korean soldiers had been waiting for an excuse to escalate the situation. Without warning, Pak gave a signal, and his men suddenly lunged forward, brandishing weapons they had concealed nearby: clubs, axes, and metal pipes. The peaceful maintenance operation instantly devolved into a scene of horrifying violence. Captain Arthur Boniface, the American officer in charge, was struck first. A North Korean soldier swung an axe directly at his skull, killing him instantly. Lieutenant Mark Barrett, attempting to intervene and rally his men to fight back, was overwhelmed by multiple assailants who beat him mercilessly with the very tools they had brought to prune the tree. The assault lasted a mere 30 seconds, but in that brief window of chaos, brutality reigned. 4 other Americans and 5 South Koreans suffered severe injuries, some left unconscious and others bleeding profusely from deep gashes and blunt force trauma. As quickly as it had begun, the attack ended. The North Koreans, having delivered their deadly message, retreated across the military demarcation line, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The surviving Americans and South Koreans scrambled to recover, their uniforms soaked in blood, their expressions a mixture of shock and fury. News of the unprovoked attack spread like wildfire through military channels, reaching the highest levels of command within hours. The brutal killings of Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett were a direct challenge to American authority in the region and a brazen provocation that demanded a response. The U.S. and South Korean governments faced a critical decision: how to retaliate without igniting a full-scale war on the Korean peninsula. The world held its breath, watching as the most heavily militarized border on Earth teetered on the brink of catastrophe. The aftermath was immediate and electric. President Gerald Ford, informed of the incident while vacationing in Colorado, immediately convened the National Security Council. The brutal killings of Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the U.S. government, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was already a powder keg, and now tensions threatened to explode into full-scale war. Satellite images revealed North Korean forces mobilizing along the border, while Soviet naval assets maneuvered into position off the Korean peninsula, signaling a potentially catastrophic escalation. Intelligence reports indicated that Kim Il-sung's regime was preparing for a possible American counterattack, prompting urgent discussions in Washington and Seoul about how to respond. The United States had to act decisively. However, the challenge lay in responding with overwhelming force while avoiding an outright war. A reckless retaliation could plunge the Korean peninsula into another devastating conflict, but inaction would signal weakness and embolden North Korea further. What followed was one of the most carefully calculated yet audacious military operations of the Cold War, Operation Paul Bunyan. Named after the legendary giant lumberjack of American folklore, the operation was designed to achieve three primary objectives. First, the poplar tree that had triggered the crisis would be removed entirely. Second, the United States and South Korea would demonstrate overwhelming military superiority to deter any further provocations. Third, a clear and unambiguous message of American resolve would be sent to North Korea, the Soviet Union, and the world without provoking an all-out war. To ensure the mission's success, the U.S. military orchestrated an unprecedented show of force. On August 21, 1976, just 3 days after the attack, a massive armada of American and South Korean forces assembled. The task force included nearly 800 troops from the U.S. Army's elite 9th Infantry Regiment and South Korea's Special Forces, all heavily armed and prepared for combat. Engineers from the 2nd Engineer Battalion were designated as the actual tree removal team, but they would not be alone. Behind them, a formidable security detail was deployed, consisting of soldiers armed with M16 rifles, grenade launchers, and M79 shotguns, forming a human shield around the workers. The plan left no room for failure. Overhead, the roar of helicopters and fighter jets filled the sky. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, each carrying a payload of nuclear-capable munitions, flew menacingly in formation from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. F-4 Phantom fighter jets from the USS Midway prowled the skies, while Cobra attack helicopters hovered at the ready. On the ground, armored vehicles including M48 Patton tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers stood by, prepared for immediate engagement. Artillery batteries and missile systems had already been primed, with the entire 2nd Infantry Division placed on full combat alert. The message was clear. If North Korea made even the slightest aggressive move, the United States and South Korea were prepared to unleash devastating force. As the convoy rolled into the joint security area at precisely 7 a.m., North Korean soldiers looked on from their side of the military demarcation line, undoubtedly aware that any intervention would result in annihilation. The tree trimming operation commenced swiftly and efficiently. Unlike the previous mission, which involved axes and hand tools, the engineers now wielded chainsaws, cutting down the entire poplar tree in less than 42 minutes. No North Korean interference was attempted. The infamous tree that had nearly sparked a war was reduced to nothing more than logs and splinters. Though the mission was over, the United States was not yet finished sending its message. The USS Midway, stationed off the coast, conducted live fire exercises, while South Korean forces along the DMZ reinforced their positions. Meanwhile, a radio transmission was sent directly to Pyongyang, informing the North Korean leadership of the tree's removal and warning of dire consequences should any further provocations occur. Within hours, the North Koreans issued a statement through their official news agency, blaming the entire incident on American imperialist aggression, but notably avoiding any threats of retaliation. The following day, North Korea's government, faced with the undeniable display of U.S. military dominance, delivered an unprecedented diplomatic message. Kim Jong-il, acting on behalf of his father, Kim Il-sung, issued a rare statement expressing regret for the incident, marking one of the few instances in history where North Korea admitted fault for an international incident. Operation Paul Bunyan had succeeded in every objective without a single shot fired. The world had teetered on the edge of another Korean War, yet a brilliantly executed operation had turned the tide without bloodshed. The mission reinforced the American commitment to defending South Korea and demonstrated to the world that any attack on U.S. personnel would be met with overwhelming and unrelenting force. Decades later, the Panmunjom axe murder incident and Operation Paul Bunyan remain defining moments in the history of Cold War confrontations. The poplar tree may be long gone, but the lessons of August 1976 endure. Strength must be balanced with restraint, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bullet, but an unmistakable show of force that leaves no doubt about the consequences of aggression. Though the Korean Peninsula remains divided to this day, the echoes of Operation Paul Bunyan serve as a reminder of how close the world once came to catastrophe, and how, with careful strategy and ironclad resolve, disaster can sometimes be averted with nothing more than a chainsaw, a show of force, and an unwavering commitment to deterrence. The planning was meticulous, orchestrated by General Richard Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in Korea. The incident had escalated far beyond a simple tree-trimming dispute, and the U.S. military was determined to respond with overwhelming force without provoking an all-out war. Every branch of the military contributed to the operation, ensuring a display of power that North Korea could not ignore. The goal was clear: to cut down the tree while sending an unmistakable message of American and South Korean resolve. At precisely 7 a.m. on August 21, 1976, Operation Paul Bunyan commenced. The work party, consisting of 23 American and South Korean engineers, carried chainsaws and axes as they approached the infamous poplar tree. Unlike the previous attempt, this time, they were not alone. A massive force surrounded them, prepared for any North Korean aggression. Two 30-man U.S. Army sniper teams from the 2nd Infantry Division were hidden in the nearby tree line, scanning for any hostile movements. 64 South Korean Special Forces commandos, wearing civilian laborer uniforms to maintain the appearance of a work crew, stood nearby with concealed M16 rifles and M79 grenade launchers, ready to retaliate at a moment's notice. Above them, the air was alive with activity. 20 utility helicopters loomed over the area, while 7 AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters hovered menacingly, their miniguns locked onto North Korean guard posts across the Demilitarized Zone. Further reinforcing the show of force, 24 F-4 Phantom fighter jets roared overhead in close formation, ready to strike. The aircraft carrier USS Midway had repositioned itself offshore, its fighter bombers primed for action. Meanwhile, in the skies above Japan, nuclear-capable B-52 bombers flew low, a deliberate and chilling reminder of the devastation that could follow any further North Korean aggression. On the ground, U.S. and South Korean infantry battalions moved into heightened alert, with tanks and artillery units positioned along the border. North Korean forces, stunned by the overwhelming military presence, did nothing but watch. Their usual belligerence was replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Within 42 minutes, the tree that had sparked the crisis was gone, cut down swiftly and efficiently. As the final branches fell to the ground, the work crew packed up and withdrew under the watchful eyes of their heavily armed escorts. Not a single shot had been fired. The overwhelming show of force had achieved its goal. North Korea, caught off guard and unwilling to provoke. A full-scale military response did not interfere. The operation ended as quickly as it had begun, but its impact was lasting. In the days following, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung issued an unprecedented statement expressing regret over the killings of Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett. While no formal apology was given, the statement was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as the regime had ever made. The message had been received. Any further aggression in the DMZ would be met with an overwhelming and immediate response. Operation Paul Bunyan remains one of the most striking examples of military deterrence in modern history. What began as a brutal murder over a tree had nearly escalated into a full-scale conflict. But through careful planning, psychological warfare, and an unmatched display of force, the crisis was resolved without further bloodshed. The infamous poplar tree was gone, and with it, any doubt about the strength of American and South Korean resolve. The scale of the backup forces assembled for Operation Paul Bunyan was staggering, a carefully calculated display of overwhelming military might. Just offshore, the USS Midway carrier battle group steamed into position, its fighter jets armed and ready for immediate deployment. Overhead, B-52 Stratofortress bombers from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam flew mock nuclear strike routes directly toward North Korea, a chilling reminder of the United States' strategic capabilities. At Osan Air Base in South Korea, squadrons of F-4 Phantom II fighter jets maintained constant combat air patrol, prepared to intercept any aerial threat. On the ground, the entire U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, reinforced by elite South Korean forces, was placed on DEFCON 3 alert, a level of readiness just one step away from full-scale war. Artillery units were primed, tank crews sat in their vehicles with engines running, and infantry battalions lined the border in a show of force not seen since the height of the Korean War. As the tree-cutting operation commenced, North Korean soldiers stationed nearby quickly took notice. They rushed toward the scene, some gripping their weapons, seemingly ready to intervene. But as they arrived, they froze in place, realizing the full scale of the American response. The skies above them buzzed with attack helicopters, the ground trembled with the presence of hundreds of heavily armed soldiers, and across the border, jets streaked past in a thunderous display of air superiority. The weight of American and South Korean firepower was undeniable. One North Korean lieutenant, visibly tense, raised his hand as if to protest. But before he could speak, an American officer, standing with arms crossed, calmly motioned toward the hovering Cobra gunships and simply stated, "Go ahead and make my day." The message was unmistakable. Any interference, any aggression, even the slightest provocation would be met with immediate and devastating retaliation. The North Korean forces, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an overwhelming show of force, did nothing. They simply stood and watched. The tree, the supposed cause of the crisis, was removed in just 42 minutes. American and South Korean engineers, their chainsaws roaring, cut it down with methodical precision, reducing the towering poplar to a mere 20-foot stump. The decision to leave part of it standing was intentional, a permanent reminder of American resolve and the consequences of North Korea's actions. But the mission didn't stop there. Before withdrawing, the team took an additional step, one that would later be jokingly referred to as Operation Paul Bunyan 2, the clear-cutting. Every tree and bush in the immediate area was cleared away, eliminating any future disputes over line-of-sight obstructions in the joint security area. As the final branches were dragged away and the chainsaws fell silent, the massive American force began its orderly withdrawal. No further conflict erupted. North Korea, despite its usual bluster and provocations, had chosen to back down in the face of overwhelming military deterrence. The crisis had been resolved without a single additional casualty. Operation Paul Bunyan remains one of the most remarkable examples of psychological warfare and military posturing in modern history. What could have been the spark for a second Korean War was instead neutralized through calculated strength and strategic intimidation. The infamous poplar tree, once the center of a deadly skirmish, was gone. In its place remained only a scarred stump and the undeniable proof that in the delicate balance of power on the Korean peninsula, overwhelming force would always dictate the outcome. The aftermath of Operation Paul Bunyan was tense as North Korea reacted with immediate military escalation. Kim Il-sung ordered the Korean People's Army to full combat readiness, deploying additional troops to forward positions along the Demilitarized Zone. Artillery batteries were primed. Tanks were moved into strategic positions, and elite special forces units were placed on high alert. The already volatile atmosphere in the joint security area grew even more charged, with North Korean soldiers standing rigid at their posts, weapons at the ready, their eyes locked on their American and South Korean counterparts. The air in Panmunjom was thick with tension, the smallest miscalculation capable of igniting a full-scale conflict.